The United Nations nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, and the Iranian government say they've reached a deal intended to ease tensions over the monitoring of some atomic sites. The agreement was struck at talks in Tehran between the IAEA chief Rafael Grossi and the head of Iran's nuclear authority. The talks with the International Atomic Energy Agency chief Grossi were aimed at easing a standoff between the Tehran and the West. The IAEA said this week that there had been no progress on two key issues. A, explaining uranium traces found at old undeclared sites and getting urgent access to monitoring equipment so the agency can continue to keep track of parts of Iran's nuclear program as per the 2015 deal. Washington and its European allies have been urging Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi's administration to return to the talks. Under the 2015 deal between Iran and the major powers, Tehran agreed to restrictions on its nuclear activities in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. The United States pulled out of the deal in 2018, reintroducing economic sanctions. Iran responded as of 2019 by breaching many of the deal's core restrictions. Professor Seyed Marandi from the University of Tehran joins us now via Zoom to share some thoughts on this development. Professor, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us and a warm welcome to the Globe.
Thank you. Good evening.
Well, this deal was widely welcomed by different quarters, and the European Union in particular saying that it created space for more diplomacy. Do you agree?
Yes, to a degree, but the real problem is that the United States and the Europeans have so far not shown any sign of being serious with regards to the full implementation of the nuclear deal. This agreement that they've been able to come to in Tehran was basically kicking the can down the road. But the solution to the problem can only come about if the United States and the Europeans abide by their commitments. Otherwise, if they do not do so, Iran will continue developing its nuclear program extensively and without any limitations, of course, within the framework of international law.
Remember, Prof, that under another deal that was struck in 2015, I believe, between Tehran and 6 other countries, namely the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, Russia and Germany, Tehran sort of agreed to stop some nuclear work in return for an end to international sanctions. So will this order or will this agreement to stop some nuclear work bear any fruit?
Well, the problem is that the deal that was struck between Iran and the P5+1 in 2015 has not been respected by the Americans or the Europeans. After the Americans signed the deal under Obama, they only partially implemented the deal. And then when Trump became president, he tore the agreement altogether. Whereas the Iranians were abiding by their commitments from day one, completely and in full, as the International Atomic Energy Agency has admitted repeatedly. And then, on the other hand, the Europeans, instead of ignoring the United States and abiding by their commitments, they basically followed the United States, whether it was Obama and his partial implementation or Trump, who implemented none of the deal and tore the deal altogether. In other words, the Europeans under Trump became just like the United States, in other words, meaning that they were in full violation of the deal. And as we speak, the United States and the Europeans continue to violate every single commitment that they have in the deal.
Yeah. Now, Prof, let's talk about the genesis of this standoff. I mean, with Iran having influenced the IAEA's ability to monitor various of its nuclear facilities, why has Iran refused to provide real-time footage from cameras and other surveillance tools that the United Nations agency has installed at these locations?
Because that's leverage. If the Europeans and the Americans don't abide by their commitments, then the Iranians reciprocate. And not giving them that sort of intrusive access is one means to put pressure on the Europeans and the Americans. if the Iranians abide by their commitments, then the Europeans and the Americans have no incentive to abide by theirs. We have to remember that when the Americans tore the deal and started violating all of their commitments alongside the Europeans, the Iranians continue, as you alluded to at the beginning of this segment, the Iranians continue to abide by all of their commitments for a full year. So for a full year, it was only Iran that was abiding by its commitments, whereas the Western countries were violating all of them. And then after a year, Iran began to gradually decrease its commitments to put pressure on the Europeans. But despite that, the Europeans still continue to violate all of their obligations. So now what the Iranians are doing is that they are refraining from giving extra cooperation. Iran is still within the framework of international law. Iran is abiding by the NPT, just like South Africa and all other countries. It's abiding by the regulations of the IAEA, but it is not implementing the nuclear deal. So this is Iran's leverage. By not giving them that extra access that they want, Iran is pushing them to get more serious at the negotiating table.
This sounds like an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth kind of principle. And you sound so pessimistic. You don't sound too confident about whether there will be, diplomatic relations between these countries, Professor.
Well, Iran does have diplomatic relations with the Europeans, with Russia, with China, and Iran has very good relations with Russia and China. The Europeans are weak. They abide by U.S. dictates. But no, I don't think that the relationship with the United States will improve, and I'm at the moment skeptical of the United States being serious about implementing the nuclear deal. And that is why I think Iran will expand the nuclear program extensively, and Iran will also tilt away from Western countries and move towards an Asian-oriented foreign policy.
And I suppose then the starting point to end the standoff and this tension is diplomacy. Then with diplomacy, then everything else will fall into place. Remember that last month, US President Joe Biden said that if diplomacy did not resolve the Iranian nuclear crisis, then America was ready to turn to other options. Are you at all, concerned of what these options may be and how adverse it would be to Iran?
No, no one in Iran takes that seriously. We've seen how the United States has retreated from Afghanistan, the humiliation that the Americans have experienced over the past few weeks in their withdrawal from Kabul airport, 2 decades of war, utter failure. Iran is not Afghanistan. Iran is not Iraq. Iran is effectively the superpower of West Asia. The United States knows that it's not in a position to fight a war with Iran, and Iran knows that as well. So if the United States wants to resolve the situation, then all they have to do is implement their side of the bargain. It's not that complicated. The reason why Iran is tilting away from the West towards an Asian-oriented foreign policy, as well as a new focus on the global South, is because Iran wants to show Western countries that we do not need you. And that is itself a form of leverage. So by expanding the nuclear program and by looking for alternative partners to the West, and we know that the West is declining, Iran is putting pressure on the West. If the West bows to this pressure and begins to abide by its commitments, then the problem is solved. Then we will have a regular relationship with Europe and the United States. Trade and business can resume. But Europeans and the Americans cannot expect Iran to appease them. They cannot expect to sign an agreement with Iran and then put new pressure on Iran and get new concessions. That's not going to work, because the Iranians know that after they sign an agreement, if the Europeans and the Americans want something more and they give it to them, then they will do it again and again and again. So the Iranians are saying, no, we have an agreement, stick to the agreement, abide by the agreement. If you do so, things move in the right direction. If you do not do so, we expand our nuclear program and move away from Europe and the United States and focus on Asia and the global South.